Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Stromness Town Hall for the Scapa 100 conference, The Orkney Story, which is brought to you this afternoon by Stromness Museum and the Scapa 100 initiative. Our first speaker of the conference is Andrew Choong. Andrew is one of the curators from the Historic Photographs and Ships Plans collections at the National Museum of Greenwich. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Andrew and give him a warm welcome this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and a big thank you to the organisers of the conference for the honour of taking the first talk, as it were, and thank you all very, very much for coming. I'm sure you're all looking forward to this conference as much as I have been. We've got some absolutely splendid talks coming up over the course of the next few days, and it's marvellous to be here with the present remnants of the High Seas Fleet on our doorsteps, and looking at not just their past, but also their present and future issues as they continue to play the role they've taken on for themselves in the culture and the historical narrative and the economic life of these islands. So it's going to be an absolutely splendid couple of days, and I'm really looking forward to it. But my task tonight is to be one of the people who winds the clock back a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about the circumstances by which the High Seas Fleet came to be here and the circumstances in which they made their successful, if highly unorthodox, application for long-term residence in Scapa Flow. So I've chosen the slightly peculiar title of luxury scrap iron. There was a two-pronged inspiration for that. One was the effort in 1908 of Arthur Balfour in his attempt to, via an open letter, to explain to the people of Germany why the British thought the naval arms race was a bad idea. And while his arguments were relatively sound, unfortunately for a man who could be tactful when he had to be, his phraseology wasn't very good and the Germans took it rather amiss. But apparently his description of the German fleet as a luxury fleet, in his attempt to show that they didn't really need this expensive behemoth that was just hacking his country off and not achieving anything strategically valuable for them, was probably not something they wanted to continue doing. Many proud Germans did not like that at all. Interestingly, many, many years later, the historian Holger Herwig published a book, also called The Luxury Fleet, in which he analysed the role of the High Seas Fleet and really what Germany had been hoping to get out of having this expensive monstrosity. And he concluded that the High Seas Fleet made a lot more sense if one looked at its political dimensions rather than its purely military and strategic dimensions. Were there Germans who wanted to challenge Britain for naval superiority? Well, yes, Tirpitz for one. But was there anything else that the fleet could do to benefit Germany? And the answer was yes, in a very interesting way that related to domestic rather than foreign politics. So one of the great insecurities of the new German Empire around the time that the first Navy laws came into force was that they were a very, very recent creation, and they were very keen for anything that would foster a sense of unity. Of course, the showpiece of the new German Empire, the army, had brilliantly won the war with France in 1870 to 1871, but even the German army was riven with regionalism, and odds were, if you asked a German infantryman, where are you from, more than even odds he might have answered, well, I'm a Bavarian, or I'm from Württemberg. So the creation of this new service would be a unifying political factor, which would be of great help in sort of creating this ideal of Germanness. Now, moving back to the strategic political front, was it worth sacrificing Britain's friendship at a time when the Germans were busily irritating France and Russia as well? Well, probably not in the end. But be as it may, the Germans invested very, very heavily in the creation of this fleet. And we're going to see how, by the end of World War I, things had gone so badly wrong that this fleet ended up transiting from a mighty military machine to very much a political pawn, to a whole lot of salvage metal. And before I really get going, I'm just going to introduce you to Richard Stumpf, the one who's made that slightly negative comment. Richard Stumpf is a very, very important voice from the German side of him. Apologies to any of you who've already heard of him or know him quite well. Do indulge me as I carry on about him for a moment or two. Stumpf was one of those rare breeds in this period, a highly educated, very literate man, served in the German Navy throughout the First World War, mainly on one of the dreadnoughts. He was on the battleship Helgoland for virtually the entirety of the conflict, before being transferred off to pre-dreadnoughts, which he was perfectly fine with, in the closing months of the war. So by the time he penned that statement, he was on the pre-dreadnought Lothringen. And of course, from Stumpf's perspective, what makes him so valuable is that unlike many of the people who were writing memoirs or keeping diaries at this time, Stumpf was not an officer. He represents the perspective of the lower deck. And after the war, when the German government was investigating the nature of the revolution that had brought the Weimar Republic to power in the end, Stumpf's diaries were used as the primary witness, if I can call it that, in the analysis of the deterioration of the lower deck from the highly motivated crowd of men of 1914 to the bitter, dispirited, and mutinous rabble of 1918. So Stumpf is great in that sense, but he's also slightly problematic because he, in terms of English translations from the German lower deck, he tends to dominate. So bear that little health warning in mind, because I'm going to make a fair bit of use of him. So what was it that had caused Stumpf to scribble that in his diary during the summer of 1918? Well, in terms of what he was thinking of at the time, it was news from the front line in August of how the Entente armies, after having taken a serious battering during the Kaiserschlacht offensive in the spring of 1918, were now counter-attacking all along the line. The German army had overreached itself in the west and was being steadily forced back. The situation had changed very, very rapidly. A glance at the map in the beginning of 1918 would have had every outward sign of a powerful Germany. Her army still occupied foreign territory in the west. In the east, the Russians had collapsed, to all intents and purposes, ceding vast amounts of territory to Germany. But underneath all this apparent success, there were serious, serious problems. So specifically, the problems that affected the German Navy were that they weren't really managing to influence the war in the way that they had promised they'd be able to. By the summer of 1918, many of the Imperial Navy's weapons had either been broken in its hand or had been rendered a strategic irrelevance. I'm going to start with their sharpest sword, the U-boat offensive. After flirting on and off with U-boat warfare, unrestricted U-boat warfare for the first part of the war, the Germans had finally initiated their last campaign in 1917. But despite the hideous losses of the winter of 1917 into the spring of 1918, the Entente powers and primarily the Royal Navy had worked out effective ways of combating the U-boat, not least stopping dragging their feet over introducing convoys. And so by the time, ironically, that the Zeebrugge raid is launched, the U-boat threat, which that raid was designed to combat, is diminishing, and it's very clear to the Germans that the U-boat is not going to be the war-winning weapon after all. What about the Imperial Navy's other weapons, mining, destroyer activity in coastal waters? Well, again, they were being beaten back on this front. They were maintaining a very busy war off the coast of the German coastline and off Belgium, but this was really just an endless attritional game of mining and counter-mining, raid and counter-raiding. It wasn't really tipping the balance anywhere. The other great hope that the Imperial Navy had started with in the spring of 1915 was their Zeppelin raids. And for a while, these had done very well. They'd had the reach to get all the way to London and beyond. They'd started a terror bombing campaign that had caused serious concern in Britain and had diverted material that was needed elsewhere. But again, the value of this weapon was fading. The very last Zeppelin raid was launched in August 1918, and it was launched only days after the so-called Black Day of the German army, in what was a final attempt of the concept of the strategic bomber in German eyes. The lead Zeppelin was shot down, the other two aborted, and that was the end of that. So the German Navy is rapidly running out of options. They're aware that their political influence is being eroded. The army, not unnaturally, has much more say and influence because they give every convincing impression of doing more. And so what have they got left? What they have is the battle fleet that, aside from operations in the Baltic and the occasional foray into the North Sea, has really just sat there in its bases, not doing very much. But there are problems here. The fleet which Germany possesses, the very powerful, hard-hitting force which gave a taste of what it could do at Jutland, is merely a shadow of its former self by 1918. So the surface fleet has suffered badly from lack of maintenance, lack of trained personnel. Large numbers of men volunteered to leave for the U-boat arm or for other services when it became clear that the battle fleet was really not going to get up to much. And it's noticeable that the number of transfers out of the fleet and the corresponding decline in maintenance begins from about December 1916 and carries on fairly steadily. Morale has deteriorated very badly, exacerbated by the fact that there's very much, if you go by Stumpf's diaries, a them and us attitude between the rank and file and the officers. Apparently a much sharper divide than existed in the Royal Navy at the time. So this growing discontent, which is added to the increasingly bad food, partly a symptom of the Entente blockade, and the maintenance of very harsh discipline, despite the fact that there's no obvious purpose to it all, is steadily eroding the morale of the German crews. Against the backdrop of all this happening, in the summer of 1918 again, the High Seas Fleet is hit by the first of the flu epidemics that they will manifest themselves much later as the Spanish flu. A lot of the accounts of the effects of the influenza deal with its post-war effects, and it's not always remembered that the Grand Fleet was hit twice by influenza outbreaks in the spring and early summer of 1918. The High Seas Fleet was similarly hit by two in the mid and late summer of that year. And that may well have contributed to the disturbances they experienced later. So all these various strands are coming together, and on top of all of this, there is a strong sense in the High Seas Fleet, again going by what Stumpf says, that they are not really playing any useful part. Many of the fleet's units are based at Wilhelmshaven. They have close connections with the local community. They feel it when the civilian population's diet deteriorates. They feel it when, as Stumpf says, they go out on useless maneuvers and burn several hundred tons of high-quality coal while civilians are shivering in the cold with nothing. And by the way, while we've been out on these maneuvers, nothing happens. We don't fight the enemy. We go back home again. And the civilians, too, think, what on earth are all these mighty battleships doing? We're being blockaded. People are going hungry. What are this lot up to? And so it's not a very healthy combination. Everything seems to happen in August. In that month, Admiral Scheer, through very adroit maneuvering, manages to create changes in the command structure between the High Seas Fleet and the central government to successfully exclude the Kaiser from decision-making and concentrating a lot of the decision-making power in his own person. This is great. Unfortunately, in doing so, he also swaps out a lot of the command elements within the fleet and in its local command structures at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel, which means that at a time when, if anything, you need strong-willed officers who the men know to try and keep order, a lot of ships suddenly find themselves with brand new captains, who might well be the new CNC's cronies, people they're not familiar with, and new arrivals who don't bring positive change with them. It's against this overall backdrop of things looking pretty bad, if I'm optimistic about it, that Scheer comes to the conclusion that the High Seas Fleet must do something to try and influence the state of the war in Germany's favour. So by October 1918, it's very clear that the going on land in the West is very bad. The German Navy is effectively out of options, as really is the German government. And so Scheer comes up with a very, very bold operational plan, codenamed Plan 19. The basic concept of this is that they will attempt to have another showdown with the main body of the Royal Navy, but this time it's going to be somewhat more sacrificial. So same sort of broad outline plan as they used at Jutland. Submarines would go ahead to ambush the Grand Fleet on its way down, destroyers would screen the advance, and the fleet would generally be hurled in the direction of the Thames estuary to cause as much mayhem and damage as it can. The hope is that the Grand Fleet will intercept them in the southern North Sea, which will place them in an advantageous position in terms of being nearer to their own bases. Damaged ships will have a better chance of getting home, for one. Secrecy is paramount. The German government is not informed of the plan, neither is the army. In fact, most people who don't need to know, and possibly quite a few who do need to know, are left off the messaging list. And the level of secrecy is so high that Scheer's deputy, Captain von Levetzow, is told to go to Wilhelmshaven to issue the operational orders verbally. This is all completely understandable in terms of the German Navy's political and tactical aims, but they've reckoned without the level of discontent and also the power of naval scuttlebutt. Again, I'm going to take Stumpf's line on this. The average German sailor is no less intelligent than his colleagues in any other navy, and it doesn't take much guessing when you see ships receiving orders to coal and embark ammunition that something is in the offing, there's an operation coming, and all of the fleet's heavy units have been ordered to stock up for a major operation. So it's not as if they're planning a pleasure cruise this time. Something definitely is up. By this time, most of the men are so disaffected that they could not be less interested. Many of them have pinned their hopes on Germany's approaches to President Wilson to bring about peace. They see no reason why they should, A, sacrifice their lives in what they see as a suicide run for nothing better than the honor of the German Navy. That cause has worn very thin by 1918. They do not see why they should indulge self-interested leaders who do not seem to be don't seem to be that interested in accompanying the fleet in person on this little death ride. They don't really grasp the idea that even if the fleet is heavily damaged and the losses are severe, the hope is that they will inflict enough damage on the British to give Germany a slightly better advantage at the bargaining table. So problems start to manifest themselves. At first, it's incidents of disobedience. The operational order calls for the fleet to be assembled by the 29th of October. This is barely achievable because of large-scale desertions or crews simply refusing to obey orders. Stumpf records lurid accounts of some of the light cruiser crews deliberately damping their fires in the boilers so that they cannot move without a great deal more preparation than their commanders were banking on. Those of them, and there are a great many who have embraced the, if you are still a loyalist German officer by this time, the poisonous ideals of communism that have been leaking out of Russia, have realized that if you can subvert the engineering branches on your ships, then the captains and officers are actually pretty powerless to do anything about it if they decide to render the engines inoperable. The other occurrence is, of course, very large-scale desertions. When Derfflinger was coming back through the Kiel Canal to obey orders and rejoin the fleet, apparently well over 100 men took the opportunity to slip off her while she was moving at reduced speed. That's not going to do wonders for your combat efficiency. And also there were rumors throughout the fleet that starting with a lieutenant on the battleship Posen, officers were being, to borrow that rather odd American term, fragged by their own men. So when the date for the sailing of this last sortie is finally given, these separate incidents coalesce into a full-blown mutiny. 4 of the battleships in the first squadron, which is the most modern dreadnoughts in the High Seas Fleet's lineup, refuse to sail. They basically say they make clear that they will fight a defensive battle if the Entente navies come, but they will do nothing more than that. So what happens is that the retaliation from Scheer is to send U-boats and torpedo boat destroyers up to the ships and say, look, we're going to arrest your ringleaders. The rest of you do as you're told. If you don't, we'll torpedo your ships. So they've reached a crisis point. Even if Scheer is able to restore order, it's clear the operation is off. It's never going to happen. He scores a temporary victory on the 29th of October, but his policy of sending the infected ships to Kiel to try and weaken the mutineers by spreading them out leads to a disaster, because as soon as the ships get to Kiel, the sailors essentially join with their comrades ashore and rise up in a mutiny, demanding the release of their ringleaders. I've just put Stump's impression of what went terribly, terribly wrong up there. But I've also chucked in Raymond Pretzel. That might be a fairly unfamiliar name. You might know him better as Sebastian Haffner. He would have only been a boy when the German naval mutiny turned into a nationwide revolution. But he was another, like Stump, he was another very sharp fellow who understood his fellow human beings fairly well and was quite good at recording what he saw. The fall of the Kaiser's government and the immediate German drive for an armistice was something that the British were very, very keen to capitalize on. As soon as the level of collapse began to become clear, the Royal Navy and the British government realized that it was imperative to neuter the High Seas Fleet and indeed the German submarine arm as quickly as they could. The obvious reason, of course, was that they didn't yet fully appreciate just what a bad state the German Navy had sunk to. But the other issue was that they didn't want the Germans to retain their fleet as a bargaining chip at the peace table. And they particularly didn't want other nations to get their hands on the High Seas Fleet. They hadn't just fought a long, hard, and costly war against a nation that posed a significant naval threat to them just to see that threat transferred elsewhere. So, about a week after the Kaiser abdicates, the Royal Navy is already in communication with the German Naval Command, trying to sort out the specifics of how the fleet will be placed in custody. The Germans initially are a bit unhappy with the whole idea. The negotiations that go on between the respective governments are quite fraught. But the Germans have very little to play with. Their armies are still in retreat in the west. The German Navy will simply not do anything other than fight defensively outside its own ports, so they don't have a leg to stand on. So on the 12th of November, the British put in a request for a formal representative of the Imperial Navy to negotiate the placement of the German fleet in their custody, and they demand that he appears by the 15th. So that photograph was actually taken on the 16th of November 1918. That's von Murer boarding the Queen Elizabeth on his second day of negotiations. A fairly lengthy account of these meetings survives in Admiral Beatty's letters, and parts of it underline just how bad things had got in the Imperial German Navy. So, in addition to the 5 German officers, including Murer, who are supposed to board the British flagship, there's a large bunch of men who identify themselves as representatives of the Soldiers and Sailors Council, and they demand to be included in the negotiations. Now, unfortunately for them, Beatty, not suffering from the same problems of revolutionary fervor as his German colleagues, is quite prepared to tell them that he knows them not and has no desire to know them any better, so they are left out of it. Much to the relief of the German officers, apparently, who were quite nervous on the journey over. They'd, of course, traveled on a light cruiser, and at least half of Königsberg's crew had made quite clear to them that they were very unhappy with them. So the agreement is made that the German fleet is going to be surrendered into British hands on the 21st of that month, and poor old Murer then has to go straight back and get things moving on that front. The Germans are served a dinner before they leave the Queen Elizabeth, and according to Captain Chatfield, one of the stewards came to him later and said, "Sir, they've left nothing but the bones." And these are the officers, the ones who are supposedly better fed. Another story that was popular around the fleet, although it's a bit harder to prove, is that one of the Marine Guards spotted one of the departing German officers stuffing something into his greatcoat pocket. And on being stopped at the gangplank, it was found that the man had nicked a piece of cheese. So obviously life was not good in His Imperial Majesty's Navy at this point. Incredibly, despite the difficulties, the German government and Navy had to deal with very, very recalcitrant crews who were now being ordered to disarm their own ships, and even worse, to sail them into an uncertain captivity for an indefinite period of time. So huge bonuses had to be paid to attract just enough men to actually get the ships operational and get them across the North Sea. By this point, it was clear they were going to Scapa Flow. There had been some weird thoughts bandied around about seeking a neutral country to host the High Seas Fleet to show good faith. Spain was considered. They might have had an easier time getting the High Seas Fleet's crewmen to take their ships in that direction. Norway was another possibility, but neither nation was keen to get involved in this, and neither particularly wanted to host ships teeming with revolutionaries and communists. From the British perspective, everyone was keen that this surrender was as public as possible. Beatty in particular wanted to go for complete and abject humiliation. He'd been deprived of the opportunity to fight a climactic battle to the finish against the High Seas Fleet. So he wanted there to be no doubt in the eyes of the British people, the German people, and the rest of the world that the High Seas Fleet was going to emerge and go into captivity as a defeated force. So everything was marvelously stage managed to ensure that that happened. Beatty wasn't taking any chances. When his fleet met the Germans, they were constantly taking bearings and ranges. They were making sure they didn't misbehave. But at the same time, this big carnival of ships, the Germans had been required to send 70. We got 69. Because one of the destroyers hit a mine on the way out and sank. But they were met by a force of well over 300 Entente ships, just to underline the point as to who was the top dog now. Cameramen were on board most of the British and Allied ships. They were also two of the non-rigid North Sea type airships overhead, just to make sure that the surrendering German ships were catalogued in, some might say, excruciating detail. So that's Friedrich de Grosser, which, as you can see from the Admiral's pennant, would have had a decidedly unhappy von Reuter on board. The awkward task of leading the fleet into captivity had fallen to him because he was the senior battle group commander. Rank clearly doesn't always have privileges. And this event, the surrender of the High Seas Fleet, was milked for everything it was worth. So Britannia Triumphant appeared in as many publications as was possible, and an enormous number of souvenir publications showing the surrendering fleet, amusingly quite a few of which don't agree with each other in terms of the placement of the ships. But these were printed and widely disseminated. There's one group of people I haven't mentioned yet over the course of this talk. While the navies and nations are debating their fate and great power politics are being played out, no one really spares a thought for the community that was going to have to play host to all these Germans who are suddenly going to be their new neighbours. That, of course, was the inhabitants of the islands surrounding the naval base at Scapa Flow. I think it would be fair to say, and this is possibly an understatement, that the inhabitants of the Orkney Islands had been thoroughly navalized by 1918. This rather charming photograph was taken on flotter by a photographer from the British fleet, and this was taken in May 1916. And if anybody recognizes him, we would love to know, because unfortunately Viscount Curzon neglected to take the boy's name when he took the photograph. But you can see that in addition to the enormous physical changes that the Royal Navy had made over the past 15 years as they'd been steadily increasing their presence in Scapa Flow, there's a great deal, clearly, of what the anthropologists like to call cultural contamination as well. So I strongly suspect that pile on the left has been left by Royal Navy crews as either surplus or unnecessary, and our enterprising young man has built a model of HMS Iron Duke. He's also very thoughtfully put the pendant number on the side of the destroyer alongside. I'm not sure how clear that is, but that identifies her as HMS Oak, which was essentially the fleet's dispatch vessel and picket boat. Bit of a sad role for a destroyer to be reduced to, but it does assure you a quiet posting. Obviously, a very observant young gentleman. So how would they take the arrival of the Imperial German Navy? I think the answer is probably in much the same way they took the arrival of the Royal Navy. It was really just a case that one very large mass of grey ships teeming with men who wanted to come ashore as often as they could, build a golf course, go on route marches, was simply going to be replaced by another group of very large grey ships, the main difference being that the new arrivals were not allowed to come ashore. So in some senses, unless you're particularly a ship spotter, the view of the flow does not really change. The Grand Fleet, of course, by this point has rebased itself down at Cromarty and Rosyth. And so really what the High Seas Fleet has done is filled a gap left by the departing fleet. But what about interaction and the conditions under which the Germans were held? Officially, this was an armistice, so they were still regarded as enemy vessels, interned enemy vessels. We're going to hear a lot more tomorrow about the perspectives of both the islanders and the Germans, and also something about the interaction, despite officialdom, that took place between the two. But officially, the British regulations concerning what the Germans could and could not do with themselves were extremely tight. They were allowed a limited amount of mail. It was a very restricted mail service. The German government had to ensure that supplies of food came in. The British weren't prepared to feed the German crews. Understandably, they had their own crews to feed. Contact between the German commander-in-chief and his British opposite number was to be done in writing. German ships were allowed to signal each other by flag and light, but only with permission and under supervision. So it was very, very restrictive. And the great problem for the Germans, of course, was you had these ships that were full of men who were not at all happy for one reason or another, social and political, or a heady mix of the two. There wasn't very much for them to do. They were in a thoroughly demoralizing position of just having to stay where they were. And in effect, they were prisoners, for want of a better term. The other thing going through von Reuter's head was the heavy responsibility he carried to his country. These were still Germany's ships. And although Germany was pretty much on the ropes and having to try and fight her corner at the peace table in Paris, he was very painfully aware that there wasn't an awful lot he could do if the British decided to try something. Ever since the German fleet had been sent to Scapa in dribs and drabs from Rosyth when they'd surrendered, plans had been put in place for the German crews aboard them to be slowly returned to Germany in batches until all that remained was skeleton crews. In some respects, this made von Reuter's life easier because he could ship off the malcontents first and solve one of his bigger headaches. But it also made his ships that much more vulnerable. A fully crewed ship is far better able to fend off a boarding party than a ship with nothing better than a care and maintenance complement. He was also aware of the deadline that was ticking down. June the 21st was the day a decision had to be made in Paris. Now, unbeknown to Reuter, although I don't know whether he suspected it or not, the British, ever since the fleet had surrendered, had laid down plans for seizing the German ships. And Admiral Fremantle, who by this point was the senior officer in Scapa Flow, was also watching the clock, like Reuter, and he was equally determined that, come what may, if the Germans looked likely to make trouble, those ships would be British by nightfall on the 23rd. That was his plan. He knew from his own sources of information that an extension had been granted to the talks in Paris. But von Reuter did not know this because his newspapers, when they did arrive, were delivered days late, and he had no way of direct communication with his own government. So, ironically enough, these parallel plans were in motion. Fremantle decided that he would initiate the plan to seize the German ships on the evening of the 23rd of June when he returned from exercises. Von Reuter, when he finally was able to count on the more reliable elements of his remaining crews, began planning for the mass scuttling that we're all so familiar with to take place on the 21st of June if he didn't hear anything to the effect that there'd been an agreement in Paris, or if he thought there was a danger the British would try to seize his ships. I'm tempted to say the rest, as they say, is history. The various events of that day are very, very familiar. Of course, there's I think the centerpiece of the experience probably belongs to the poor school kids on the Flying Kestrel who are probably enjoying their trip round the High Seas Fleet. You know, here we go, look at the big, evil, wicked Hun battleships. Until all of a sudden the unexpected started happening. The British forces in the flow don't seem to have noticed the initial signal hoisted by the Emden or the other German ships acknowledging initially. What they did notice was the Imperial German battle flags unfurling at about the same time that the first ships began to founder. Now, I'm just going to linger on the decision to raise the battle flags because the Germans had been strictly forbidden from doing that the day they surrendered their fleet. There had been a very unpleasant near kerfuffle on the 31st of May when they had some of their ships had attempted to raise their flags in honor of the Battle of Jutland, and that had been squashed very, very quickly. But the raising of the flags is important. It's not just a random act of defiance. The ships, by time-honored naval tradition and their crews, are identifying themselves as combatants once more. So von Reuter is effectively telling the British forces, it's on again, the truce is over. Now, this isn't just bravado. I suspect that there was an important reason under the rules of engagement at the time, because it ensured that whatever happened, his men would be treated as prisoners of war, assuming the British followed the rules as they were understood at the time. Of course, the Germans had timed it extremely well. Admiral Fremantle and most of his fleet were out at sea on exercises, and the British forces in the flow comprised destroyers, trawlers, support vessels. They weren't really in a position to do as much as a full fleet would have done. And also the Germans had achieved complete tactical surprise. It never ceases to amaze me that the total number of German casualties inflicted on the day was less than 30, taking killed and wounded at a time, relative to the amount of ammunition expended, even if a lot of that was simply with the intention of driving them back aboard their ships to try and prevent them from allowing them to sink. Despite the surprise, the British forces did react with commendable swiftness, and as you can see, Admiral Fremantle was informed very, very quickly of what was going on. But on the whole, the German operation succeeded brilliantly. Of the destroyers, somewhat less than half were prevented from sinking. Similar figure with the light cruisers, and of the battleships, the only one that was immediately in any kind of salvageable state was Baden. All the rest of the German ships were either completely scuttled or were partially scuttled, but in such a state that their salvage would involve a huge amount of effort. I think Admiral Fremantle was cross, very cross. One gets that impression from what he said. Obviously, von Reuter's name was mud after that, but not only among the British, not among the Germans. A much happier Admiral Scheer found himself able to say the stain of dishonor has been wiped from the escutcheon of the German fleet. And on the whole, I personally believe that von Reuter acted honorably with the information that he had, and it was, if I may say, a pretty well-planned and well-executed operation, given what he had to work with. Well, so much for the immediate reactions within the fleet. As you can see from Lieutenant David's comments, not all of the British were terribly comfortable with the idea of shooting German sailors who were unarmed aboard ships that were not able to fight. And of course, great controversy surrounds the death of the captain of Markgraf, who was shot by a Royal Marine while he was in a lifeboat. So it's a bit hard to see how he was doing anything threatening when that went on. So much for the immediate reactions. What about the more important, strategically important ones? When news got to Paris, it created something of a ripple. The much harassed Admiral Weems, Admiral Beatty's deputy who was overseeing the Royal Navy's delegation in Paris, was actually mightily relieved, for one thing. He'd had people beating a path to his door from every nation that had sided with the Entente powers, wanting a chunk of the German fleet. And as far as he was concerned, the best place for it could be the bottom of the sea. Britain had no interest in taking on these ships. While these negotiations were being thrashed out, the Treasury was doing its sums looking towards the post-war era, and it was quite clear to them, if not yet to Britain's armed forces, that they did not want to subsidize a massive addition to the existing Royal Navy. I'm just going to bore you with some numbers. In the Navy estimates in Parliament for the years 1918 to 1919, the sum allocated for the total upkeep of the Royal Navy is in the order of £650 million, which is quite a lot in 1918, I think. I don't know what it is in present-day currency, but the number would probably frighten us. In the Navy estimates for 1919 into 1920, that has shrunk to £55 million. It's quite possibly the single most brutal cut any one of Britain's armed forces has ever suffered at a stroke. So in that context, you can see why Britain was not really interested in the German ships. Added to that was the fact that many of them had been allowed to deteriorate between 1916 and 1918 to the point where you wouldn't want to refurbish them either, because that would be terribly costly. Equally, Britain doesn't want to see them in anybody else's hands. The United States was not overly bothered. They had shared a lot of information of a technical nature with their British colleagues. US dreadnought design, and it was dreadnoughts the US was primarily interested in this period, had wobbled slightly in the years before 1914, but every class of battleship they built after the New York class of 1914 were superb warships, definitely the equal or even slightly better than their British and German equivalents, and there was nothing really that the High Seas Fleet could add to the US Navy. It would just be an expensive financial burden when they might as well build better ships. The US Navy was heading for a similar cut in finance, but they just didn't know it yet. And they were still keen on their idea of building a fleet second to none. The French were not overjoyed. One of the fruits of the Entente Cordiale was that from 1912 onwards, France had taken the conscious decision to focus virtually all of her defense spending on the army at the expense of the navy, and no new French dreadnought had been built since 1912. And when we consider the technological changes that had been seen in the years between 1912 and 1918, there were some ships in the German fleet that France would have dearly loved to have. In fact, they felt very let down because they'd been pushing towards getting Britain's agreement for 25% of the High Seas Fleet to go to France, possibly even 30% if they could argue it well enough. So, of course, the sudden disappearance of this asset they were hoping to gain caused a great deal of fury. The Italians were in a similar position to France, and they too had wanted a 25%. But they were slightly better off. In 1914, they'd constructed the Cavour-class battleships, and during the war, they'd continued their naval building. So their primary enemy, Austria, had been eliminated by the First World War. Their secondary budgetary enemy, France, had just had the rug pulled out from under them. So unhappy we didn't get our 25%, but otherwise it's all looking good. The Japanese reaction is the most fascinating. It amounts to a collective, massively raised eyebrow. But they did request that the Inter-Allied Naval Commission give them copies of the technical drawings and technical documentation that the Germans had to surrender along with the fleet. And what is interesting is that over the following years, the Japanese sign out more plans than any of the other interested powers. They don't seem to have been overly impressed by most of what they found. Japanese shipbuilding and naval technology generally continues to follow the British pattern in the years after the war. But of course, the fate of the High Seas Fleet was only one element in all the wrangling that was taking place to decide the future of Europe and parts of the rest of the world in the aftermath of World War I. And with the sinking of the High Seas Fleet and the initial outburst of anger or shrugged shoulders, the whole business is very rapidly forgotten. Britain has a very small consolation prize in the fact that Baden didn't completely sink and was very easily salvageable. Officially, they wanted Germany's most modern battleships because or battleship in this case, because they developed a new kind of shell in the aftermath of Jutland, and they'd been terribly keen to try it out. And so poor old Baden, it's a bit difficult to say whether Baden or Bayern got the worst end of the deal. Baden, because she failed to sink during the scuttling, over the next year or so is subjected to some rather destructive tests. And if anyone's interested in following that up, in one of the 1920 editions of the Engineer Journal, the results of those tests are reproduced almost shell by shell. But just to look at the interesting transition point where the High Seas Fleet effectively, although no one knew it at the time, ceased to be a German institution and effectively became a part of the Orkney Islands in a very significant way. Of course, there's this incredible event in history which now very much belongs to these islands. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, the High Seas Fleet has woven itself very much into the historical narrative, the present culture, and the economic present and future of the Orkney Islands. It certainly isn't what the Germans initially intended for it, although if I pick up on what Holger Herwig's book touched on again, in a sense, the German fleet was a political instrument. The only irony there is that it was not the political instrument its masters imagined it would be. It was hugely political in 1918, definitely not in the manner the Kaiser wanted. And in a sense, it's hugely political today, touching on everything from our relations with Germany to legal matters in Britain, to how we look at heritage and tourism. So it's very much still there. It's quite a burden for 7 ships to carry out of the original 50 that were scuttled, but they bear it quite well. Thank you very much for listening. On that happy note, I'm just going to end off with a lovely picture of Moltke wreaking vengeance and havoc on the Royal Navy from beyond the grave. And if there are any, I'll take your questions.